The morning of April 9, 1288, found the Bach Dang River shrouded in dense fog. Through this gray veil, 400 Mongol warships advanced in disciplined formation. Their keels sliced through the water with unwavering resolve, bearing the mark of an empire that had conquered half the world. Towering on the flagship's bow was Admiral Amar, son of the Yunnan governor, a veteran who had overseen the destruction of the Song Empire, and arguably the Yuan Dynasty's finest naval commander. He gazed intently ahead towards the river mouths and the open sea, understanding that within a few hours his fleet would reach safe harbor. Behind lay the ruins of a failed invasion. Ahead, home and the chance to regroup for another attempt to subjugate these tenacious Vietnamese. The tide was in full flow. The waters surged deeply and swiftly beneath his vessels. Everything pointed to success. Then, from the morning mist, several small Vietnamese junks appeared. They seemed pitiful compared to his colossal warships, barely a tenth their size, manned by crews who had been fleeing for months. They fired a few volleys of arrows, more as a distraction than a genuine attack, and then did precisely what Amar expected. They turned and fled. Amar allowed himself a faint smile. "Pursue them," he commanded. "Destroy them before they reach the tributaries." His captains needed no further encouragement. The heavy Yuan ships surged forward, oars working in unison, delving deeper into the river. The Vietnamese vessels fled before them like rabbits before wolves. Their smaller hulls somehow navigated the narrowing channel with desperate speed. The Mongol ships followed, their commanders yearning for one last victory to salvage some honor from this failed campaign. The Vietnamese boats continued their flight, and the Mongol ships pressed the chase, venturing deeper and deeper into the river. The banks gradually closed in on both sides, and beneath the rising morning tide, unseen by every man aboard those 400 warships, lay a weapon that Admiral Amar had dismissed as primitive. A weapon 350 years old. A weapon that, in just a few hours, would utterly annihilate the most powerful fleet in the world. But what Amar didn't know, what none of his men could know as they chased these fleeing Vietnamese boats deeper into the Bach Dang, was that they were already doomed. The only question was how long it would take them to realize it. Let me tell you about Admiral Amar, because if you want to grasp why what happened on the Bach Dang was so devastating, so perfectly ironic, you need to understand precisely who this man was. Amir Nazalan Albri was no mere court appointee playing at war. This man had earned his reputation through blood and fire. His father was the Mongol-appointed Khwarezmian governor of Yunnan, meaning Amar grew up within the empire's machinery, understanding power from within. But unlike many privileged sons, Amar distinguished himself on the water. During Kublai Khan's conquest of the Song Dynasty, Amar led the vanguard fleet that pursued the remnants of Chinese naval power from Guanghua all the way to the coast. He battled against Chinese admirals who had built and commanded ships for 1,000 years, and he defeated them. When the Song mounted their last desperate counterattack at Guangzhou in July 1278, it was Amar who repelled them. This man understood naval warfare as a master understands his tools. In 1285, during the second Mongol invasion of Vietnam, Amar himself pursued the Vietnamese king at sea. He drove King Tren Thien Tong from the coast near Chonju, narrowly missing his capture in April of that year. The king of an entire nation fled before Amar's ships. This is the caliber of man we are discussing. Therefore, when Kublai Khan organized his third invasion of Vietnam in 1287, appointing Amar as naval commander alongside generals Fanay Mahmud, it was not due to sentiment or politics. It was cold, calculated strategy. If anyone could break Vietnamese resistance from the sea, it was this man. 500 warships, 18,000 marines, 70 transport vessels, tens of thousands of sailors. This was no mere diversionary force. It was an armada designed to crush a nation. And initially, everything went exactly according to plan. The two-pronged invasion, which began in late 1287, was colossal even by Mongol standards. Prince Tagon, Kublai's own son, led between 100,000 and 170,000 ground troops from Guangxi and Yunnan. A Mars fleet sailed from Quan Cho, aiming to form a massive pincer movement that would choke Vietnam into submission. The forces included Mongols, Jurchens, Han Chinese from 4 different provinces, Yunnanese troops, former Song soldiers who had defected, and even 17,000 Li troops from Hainan. This represented the full might of the Yuan Dynasty, heirs to the Genghis Khan Empire, directed against a single modest Southeast Asian kingdom. If any military strategist of that era were asked about the likely victor, they would have probably viewed the questioner as deranged for even posing such an inquiry. On February 3, 1288, Prince Togon's forces entered Thang Long, the Vietnamese capital, now known as Hanoi. His soldiers streamed through the gates, weapons prepared for the climactic stand they fully anticipated. However, what awaited them was silence. The city lay deserted, yet not in a panicked disarray, with abandoned belongings and gaping doors. Its emptiness hinted at a meticulously crafted, deliberate strategy. Grain silos were utterly bare. Warehouses contained nothing but dust. Every morsel of food, every useful implement an army might need, had vanished. The Vietnamese monarch, his court, and his army were gone. The entire civilian population had melted into the countryside, like morning mist dissipating under the sun. This was a scorched earth strategy executed with surgical precision, leaving Togon with only a meager prize. An army exceeding 100,000 men cannot subsist on pride and conquered territory alone. And the Vietnamese had ensured there was nothing else left. Then, the true horror began. The Vietnamese had no intention of fighting conventionally, or, more accurately, they wouldn't fight in a manner convenient for the Mongols. There were no grand battles, no dramatic confrontations where the might of Mongol cavalry and tactics could decide the outcome. Instead, there were ambushes, nighttime raids, bridges collapsing under the weight of supply convoys, and roads suddenly terminating in impenetrable swamps. Relentless and unceasing harassment afforded the invaders no respite. The tropical heat, a lifelong companion for the Vietnamese, physically assailed the Mongol soldiers. Men who had conquered the Central Asian steppes and Chinese plains found themselves enervated simply by existing in this sweltering, humid environment. Diseases proliferated through the camps. Supply lines stretched ever thinner, becoming fragile threads that Vietnamese guerrillas severed with increasing frequency. Then, in January 1288, the first significant disaster struck. General Chang Hantu, commanding the Vietnamese fleet stationed off Van Don Island near Ha Long Bay, had been observing and waiting. He received intelligence about the approach of a massive Yuan Dynasty supply fleet, led by Zhang Wenhu. 70 vessels, laden with provisions desperately needed by Togon's starving forces, were inbound. He launched a striking force of 30 warships. The Vietnamese descended upon Zhang's supply fleet like sharks on wounded prey. They incinerated it, burning everything to ashes. 70 ships, transporting 7 million kilograms of rice and provisions, became floating infernos, illuminating Ha Long Bay. Some of Zhang's remaining ships were blown off course by powerful northeast monsoon winds. Others drifted adrift in chaos. Zhang himself was forced to flee back to Hainan Island. When Wang Chang-Nank heard this news, he instantly grasped its significance. The Yuan forces are most in need of supplies, he stated. Perhaps they are not yet aware of the destruction of their transport fleet and are planning further offensive actions. But there will be no more offensives. The Mongol army in Thang Long, numbering over 100,000, began to starve. On March 5th, Togon abandoned the capital he had captured just a month prior and retreated to the Yuan base at Van Keep. By March 30th, with his predicament growing more dire each day, he ordered a full withdrawal to China. His army, once the pride of the Yuan dynasty, now resembled a broken mob more than a triumphant force. The Vietnamese pursued them relentlessly. Near Lang Gon, around April 10th, Prince Togon himself was wounded by a poisoned arrow. He was forced to abandon his warship and escape through the forests on foot, accompanied by the few loyal and combat-ready warriors remaining. The majority of his ground forces were annihilated or captured during that horrific retreat. Yet, Amar's fleet remained intact, and this made it dangerous. 400 warships represented too much power to simply write off. Even in retreat, they could bombard coastal positions, extract remnants of the ground troops, or form the basis for another invasion attempt. Amar had to bring these ships home to China, and there was only one practical route: down the Bach Dang River to the open sea. Amar felt confident as his fleet entered the river on the morning of April 9th. And why wouldn't he? He had vanquished the Song Dynasty fleet. He had pursued kings into the ocean. His ships were undamaged, his crews seasoned. The path to retreat was clear. Yes, the campaign as a whole had been a disaster. Yes, Togan had suffered a crushing defeat on land. But Amar would save the fleet, and the fleet could be used again. Little did he know, a Vietnamese general, 60 years of age, named Tren Hung Dao, had been meticulously preparing a special surprise for him over the past month. It was a tactic Admiral Amar, with his vast experience, confidence, and specialized knowledge, would have dismissed as belonging to a more primitive era. He was soon to discover that sometimes ancient methods endure because they consistently prove effective. 350 years before Admiral Amar led his fleet into Bach Dang, a Vietnamese commander named No Quyen faced a similar challenge on these precise shores. The year was 938 CE. Their enemy was the Southern Han, a Chinese state whose dominion over Vietnam had been so enduring that independence seemed an unattainable dream. And so, No Quyen watched as a formidable enemy fleet navigated this waterway, intent on quashing yet another Vietnamese insurrection and reasserting Chinese dominance. What No Quyen did next brought an end to a millennium of Chinese imperial rule and cemented itself into legend. He instructed his troops to drive hundreds, perhaps thousands, of sharpened wooden stakes, tipped with iron, into the riverbed. These stakes were positioned to point upwards, towards the river's mouth. During high tide, these stakes lay hidden beneath the water's surface, imperceptible to anyone sailing above. No Quyen then dispatched a small fleet of agile Vietnamese vessels to provoke the Southern Han fleet. These boats executed hit-and-run attacks before retreating upstream. The Southern Han warriors, anticipating an easy victory, pursued them on their heavy warships. As the tide receded, the water levels dropped, and suddenly, these wooden stakes emerged from the river, resembling the teeth of some enormous, unknown creature. The Southern Han ships, too massive to halt or maneuver quickly, impaled themselves upon these stakes. Hulls cracked, and vessels capsized. Soldiers and sailors, burdened by their armor, drowned, while Vietnamese archers on the banks rained arrows down on anyone attempting to reach safety. The Southern Han prince, Liu Hongkao, drowned alongside most of his men. This single battle marked the cessation of Chinese suzerainty over Vietnam. In 939, No Quyen declared himself king and relocated his capital to Co Lo, a site that symbolized traditional Vietnamese royalty prior to the Chinese conquest. The implicit message was clear. Vietnam had reclaimed its identity, and so it would remain for centuries. The Battle of Bach Dang in 938 became a fundamental military legend in the pursuit of Vietnamese independence. Every Vietnamese child learned of those stakes. Every military officer studied this strategy. And as Vietnam repeatedly confronted invasions in the following centuries, its military leaders recalled this battle, drawing inspiration from it. However, legendary tactics from past eras possess a peculiar characteristic. By the 13th century, during the Mongol invasions, the notion of wooden stakes in a riverbed seemed antiquated, primitive, a relic from simpler times, before modern warfare evolved beyond such rudimentary methods. The Mongols had conquered half the known world through sophisticated military tactics that would command the respect of contemporary generals. Complex combined arms warfare, coordinating cavalry, infantry, and siege weaponry. Psychological operations designed to terrify adversaries into complete submission before the first arrow was even loosed. Intricate intelligence networks that meticulously mapped enemy territories and identified vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. Siege engines capable of reducing fortified cities to rubble. Composite bows effective at seemingly impossible distances. and early forms of gunpowder weaponry. Their naval expertise was acquired from subjugated Chinese shipbuilders and mariners. This was an armed force that had annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, subjugated Rus, ravaged Eastern Europe, and ultimately brought down the Song dynasty after decades of intricate military campaigns. These were not barbaric hordes. This was the most efficient military apparatus the medieval world had ever witnessed. And Amar personified this sophistication. He had learned naval strategy from Chinese masters, then surpassed them in their own domain. He commanded ships representing centuries of technological refinement. His crews had fought in numerous engagements along the Chinese coast. When Amar observed Vietnamese fortifications, he viewed them through the eyes of a man who had studied and triumphed over advanced military systems. So, when intelligence reports, almost certainly reaching Amar's ears at some point during the campaign, mentioned that the Vietnamese might attempt to employ the old Bach Dang tactic, what did he conclude? Imagine it from his vantage point. You are an admiral who helped conquer the Song dynasty. You have pursued Vietnamese kings all the way to the sea. You command 5 of Asia's most advanced warships, and someone suggests you should be concerned about wooden sticks in a river. The Southern Han dynasty, defeated by No Qian in 938, was a regional power struggling to control southern China during a period of fragmentation. Admiral Amar represented the Yuan Dynasty at its zenith, commanding history's most expansive continuous empire. The Song dynasty, which he assisted in conquering, possessed sophisticated military junks, marvels of technology featuring multiple decks, intricate sail layouts, and even rudimentary naval artillery. Yet, the Vietnamese believed simple wooden stakes could halt the Yuan's formidable warships. This seemed utterly absurd, ludicrous, akin to confronting a firearm with a knife, or in this context, employing medieval tactics in a 13th century naval engagement. However, Amar failed to grasp a crucial aspect. His own deep experience, vast knowledge, and overconfidence blinded him to the obvious. The Bach Dang River wasn't merely a waterway, it held the key. It was a broad estuary, spanning over 2 kilometers at its mouth, where freshwater from numerous tributaries mingled with the saline waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Like all estuaries, it experienced significant tidal fluctuations, but the Bach Dang's tides were particularly pronounced. From midnight until morning, the water surged with incredible speed, its level rising several meters. This transformed shallow areas into deep channels, concealing rocks, sandbars, and other underwater hazards. The incoming tide generated a swift and potent current, powerful enough to propel a ship upstream even without oars. Then, around midday, the tide reversed. The water didn't just recede, it retreated with the same astonishing velocity it had risen. Within hours, deep channels became exposed sandbars. The riverbed lay bare, and any stationary obstacle, safely submerged during high tide, suddenly became a dangerous obstruction, posing a threat to any vessel that hadn't navigated out in time. The riverbed itself was uneven, rocky in places, with many tributaries feeding into the main channel. The Bach Dang snaked through mountainous terrain, creating unpredictable currents and whirlpools. It was a navigator's nightmare, even without hostile forces. For the lighter Vietnamese boats, designed over generations specifically for these waters, the Bach Dang was their natural element. They knew the deep channels. They understood how to read the currents. Most importantly, they recognized precisely how much leeway they needed and where to find it. In contrast, for the massive Yuan warships, built for open ocean combat and deep harbors, crewed by sailors from the Chinese coast unfamiliar with these particular waters, the Bach Dang was a trap poised to spring shut. They simply weren't aware of it yet. And then there's the 350-year-old tactic. If an idea endures for 3.5 centuries, there's usually a compelling reason. Tran Hung Dao was 60 years old when he chose to revive a weapon from among his great-great-grandfather's strategies. While perhaps not exceptionally ancient by our standards, in the 13th century, when most men considered themselves fortunate to reach 40, 60 was truly advanced age. He had already defeated the Mongols once before, in 1285, employing guerrilla warfare and scorched earth tactics to drive them back across the border. He had earned the title of Supreme Commander of all Vietnamese forces. He had proven his capabilities, which made what transpired next even more remarkable. For when Tran Hung Dao unveiled his plan to his generals in March 1288, they must have believed the old man had finally lost his mind. The scene on the River Ha is recorded in Vietnamese historical chronicles. Tran Hung Dao gathered his commanders and swore a public oath, gambling not only his reputation, but his very life. If the Mongols are not crushed, he vowed before them all, we shall never cross this river again. This was the kind of dramatic gesture that either elevates you to legend or transforms you into a cautionary tale of hubris. There's no middle ground. When you publicly swear never to retreat, you must commit. He then laid out his strategy. They would use wooden stakes driven into the Bach Dang riverbed to destroy Amar's fleet. I imagine the deafening silence that followed this announcement, because everyone in that room knew No Quin's story, and everyone also knew that 350 years had passed since then. Naval warfare had evolved. Shipbuilding had progressed. The Mongols were not the Southern Han. This was the Yuan Dynasty, for heaven's sake. The people who had conquered China and were currently attempting to conquer Japan, with the largest amphibious fleet in history up to that point. The unspoken question must have hung in the air. Wooden stakes, really? Is that what we're counting on? Tran Hung Dao's answer, as I can reconstruct it from historical records, essentially amounted to this: yes, wooden stakes. As Amar busied himself with devising advanced strategies and intricate naval maneuvers, planning a battle he was accustomed to fighting, the opposition prepared to neutralize him with a weapon so ancient he had likely forgotten its existence. Subsequently, the precise execution of this plan was laid bare by Tran Hung Dao, and what initially seemed preposterous suddenly appeared remarkably plausible. The first crucial step involved meticulous tidal analysis. This wasn't a cursory understanding of the ebb and flow. Tran Hung Dao dedicated weeks to rigorously studying the exact tidal patterns of the Bach Dang River. He needed precise knowledge of the peak high tide, the exact moment the water would begin to recede, its rate of descent, the deepest channels that would remain accessible at low tide, the areas where the riverbed would become exposed, and the water level at every hour of the day. This was a scientific endeavor, devoid of superstition. Essentially, Tran Hung Dao conducted a detailed hydrographic survey, utilizing instruments and methods available in the 10th century. He measured, calculated, and timed everything with obsessive accuracy. This level of detail was paramount because the entire scheme hinged on impeccable timing. Being off by even a few hours, either too early or too late, would result in Amar's fleet either spotting the stakes before entering the danger zone or escaping before the tide receded enough to trap them. The window for success was incredibly narrow, demanding a minute-by-minute execution plan. Next came the production of the stakes, where Tran Hung Dao's attention to detail truly shone. He didn't merely instruct his men to cut down trees and sharpen them. He specified particular wood types, ironwood, known to the Vietnamese as limba, along with tu and senwood. These were the hardest timbers available in Vietnam, wood that would resist rotting and softening after weeks in brackish water, and that could withstand the relentless pressure of tidal currents without breaking or shifting. The stakes varied in length from 2 to 5 meters. Their lower ends were sharpened to facilitate driving them into the riverbed. Some were reinforced with iron tips to enhance their lethality and durability. Their tops were intentionally broken or roughened, rather than smooth, to tear through hulls instead of simply piercing them. However, the most significant detail was Tran Hung Dao's order for his men to position these stakes at varying angles. Some were upright, pointing directly skyward. Others were tilted at a 15-degree angle, facing west. Still others were angled at 45 degrees, oriented south, towards the river mouths. This was not random. It meant that regardless of the direction a ship attempted to turn, or how it tried to avoid the stakes once visible, other stakes awaited to ensnare it from a different angle. The stakes were arranged in a zigzag formation, resembling a colossal Z stretched across the riverbed, with individual stakes spaced approximately 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart. This spacing was close enough that even light boats had to navigate cautiously, yet sufficiently wide that during high tide, when the stakes were submerged, the river appeared completely normal to anyone sailing above them. Then came the most arduous part, actually installing these formidable obstacles. Driving stakes into the riverbed was only feasible during low tide, when the bed was exposed. This granted Tran Hung Dao's laborers restricted daily windows to complete the task, and it was March in northern Vietnam, which meant cold rain, northeastern winds, and generally dreadful working conditions. Historical records specifically mention that the laborers drove these stakes in freezing rain, highlighting the extraordinary discipline and dedication required. They had to install hundreds, possibly thousands, of these stakes in multiple locations. The primary stake fields were situated in 3 tributaries of the river, Chan, Ken, and Ru, all flowing into the Bach Dang from the north. Additional stake fields were established in Sao Quai, near Huang, and in Yan Yang, within Quang Ninh province. This was not a single bottleneck, but a series of overlapping kill zones designed to drive Amar's fleet into an inescapable trap. All of this had to be executed in absolute secrecy. If Amar learned of these preparations, if one of his scouts observed the stakes during low tide, the entire plan would unravel, and the Vietnamese would have revealed their strategy and wasted weeks of grueling labor. Therefore, the work proceeded quietly, cautiously, with such stringent security that even many Vietnamese soldiers were unaware of what was being prepared. Finally, Tran Hung Dao positioned his military forces. A small Vietnamese fleet, tasked with luring Amar, concealed itself behind the Hong Kok Reef and other natural features, out of sight from the river's mouth. Ground forces stationed themselves along both banks of the Bach Dang, hidden within the vegetation and behind natural landscape features. They had prepared flaming arrows, gathered stones for throwing, and arranged flammable materials suitable for hurling at enemy vessels. Everyone assumed their positions and waited. I want you to consider what Tran Hung Dao actually accomplished at 60 years old. He confronted an admiral who had helped conquer the Song Dynasty, commanding a navy only a fraction of the size of the one he would have to face. The odds were so overwhelmingly against him that even his own generals likely harbored doubts. Yet, Tran Hung Dao grasped a truth that Amar, despite all his experience, failed to comprehend. He understood that the fundamental essence of warfare lies in matching the appropriate tool to the specific situation. Amar brought advanced warships designed for open ocean combat. Tran Hung Dao brought the river, the science of tides, wooden stakes, and patience. If it were a contest of who had superior ships, Amar would have triumphed. If it were a test of who had more naval combat experience, Amar would have prevailed. If it concerned crew training or fleet size, Amar would consistently have held the advantage. But Tran Hung Dao presented him with different terms. He offered Amar a simple choice: navigate the Bach Dang River during its full tide, or seek an alternative route. And Amar, confident in his vessels, crews, and personal abilities, chose the river. Sometimes, the greatest military victories are not won by the nation with the most advanced technology, but by the one with a more profound understanding of the battlefield. Amar was an expert, but Tran Hung Dao was fighting on his home ground. This changed everything. Allow me to elaborate on the events of April 9, 1288, because these specifics are crucial, and understanding them provides a full appreciation of how flawlessly Tran Hung Dao orchestrated this catastrophe. The morning began with a fog. While not uncommon for a spring morning in the estuary, this fog was thick enough to limit visibility to a few hundred meters. Amar's fleet entered the Bach Dang on a surging high tide, as the water level neared its peak. If you were standing on the deck of one of these Yuan ships, looking down at the water, you would see nothing but the dark river flowing beneath you, deep and fast. Seemingly unhindered, the flotilla advanced in formation. 400 warships plus auxiliary vessels, thousands of men. The pride of Yuan naval power in Southeast Asia. They had been retreating for several days, weary from harassment by Vietnamese forces. And everyone aboard these vessels yearned only to reach the open ocean and return home. The mouth of the Bach Dang loomed ahead, likely visible through gaps in the fog, promising salvation from this accursed land that had swallowed their invasion. Then, Vietnamese boats emerged from the mist. There were few of them, perhaps 20 or 30 light junks, tiny compared to the massive Yuan warships. They appeared from tributaries and behind reed beds, firing bows as they moved. This was not a serious assault, but rather a continuation of the debilitating tactics they had employed for weeks. Pinprick raids that caused more annoyance than damage. It was what one might expect from a defeated foe making a last, desperate gesture. Amer's commanders barely needed orders. They knew what to do with fleeing Vietnamese boats: pursue, overtake, destroy. The Yuan warships surged forward. Oars rhythmically cut through the water. Sails caught the residual breeze that permeated the fog. It was a welcome change, finally moving to offensive action after a week of retreat. It restored a sense of dominance. The Vietnamese boats fled. And this is important. They fled convincingly. These were not vessels executing a fighting retreat, pausing to fire and then withdrawing to fire again. These were boats escaping in obvious panic. Their crews rowed with all their might, choosing any course that offered them the best speed away from the pursuing warships. They appeared defeated, they appeared frightened, they appeared exactly as Amor expected. So, the Yuan fleet chased them deeper into the river. The Vietnamese boats escaped upstream, following the main channel, and the Mongol ships followed. Now, they were fully engaged. The entire fleet moved as a single entity. Captains competed to be the first to catch the enemy, and the riverbanks gradually converged on both sides. But not too sharply. It was still a wide waterway. Plenty of room for naval maneuvers, no cause for concern. The Vietnamese continued to retreat. The Mongols continued to pursue. Minutes stretched into an hour. The hour extended further. And all this time, Tran Hung Dao, observing from his position along the riverbank, awaited one specific event: the turning of the tide. It arrived around mid-morning. That subtle moment when the water ceases its ascent and begins, almost imperceptibly at first, to recede. Unless you were specifically watching for it, you wouldn't notice. The current shifted, transitioning from an upstream flow to a pull towards the sea. The water level, previously appearing constant, began to recede. Vietnamese vessels continued their retreat, but now their withdrawal seemed more organized, as if adhering to specific routes, navigating through tributary mouths and utilizing channels that appeared to narrow and shallow as the morning progressed. Certain commanders under Chang Da, those who perceived the unfolding situation, started to disengage. Their mission was accomplished, losses sustained, and it was now time to depart the combat zone. The Mongol fleet persisted in its pursuit, too deeply committed to turn back. Besides, why would the Vietnamese be directly ahead, finally engaging instead of fleeing inland? A few more minutes, and they would be within bowshot. A few more after that, and it would be close quarters combat, where Mongol discipline and training invariably prevailed. Then, someone on one of the lead Yuan ships felt a grinding sensation beneath the hull. A slight contact with a submerged sandbank likely registered as a barely perceptible drag. The captain probably immediately issued an order for a minor course correction. Nothing serious, just enough to bypass whatever obstruction they had grazed. Soon, another vessel, and then a third, struck the bottom. Somewhere amidst this fleet, perhaps on the flagship, Admiral Amar must have experienced the initial chilling pangs of realization. He would have glanced at the water level, then at the riverbanks, which now seemed slightly higher than an hour prior, and noticed how the Vietnamese boats, those light, flat-bottomed junks, continued to move freely, while his heavy warships were already encountering the riverbed. The tide was ebbing. The water was receding, and at that moment, the first wooden stake emerged on the surface. Imagine a dark, roughly fashioned form, perhaps 3 or 4 inches in diameter, rising from the water like an accusing finger. One stake, then another, then 10, then hundreds, appearing across the river's width as the water level dropped, revealing what had been hidden beneath the surface for weeks. This realization struck the UN commanders like a physical blow. These were not natural obstructions. These were wooden stakes. Someone had intentionally driven wooden stakes into the riverbed, and this signified, "Turn around." Orders echoed through the fleet. "Return to the sea, alter course." But it's impossible to maneuver 400 warships instantly, especially in a river channel that was becoming shallower by the minute. The lead ships attempted to turn, colliding with vessels behind them. Captains shouted contradictory commands. Ropes tangled, formations dissolved into chaos, and the tide continued to fall. More stakes appeared. The water level dropped with that peculiar speed seen only in tidal rivers, as if retreating from the sides of the stranded ships. It seemed the river itself was abandoning them. What had been a navigable channel 30 minutes earlier was transforming into a forest of wooden spikes. The first ship impaled by the stakes likely attempted to turn too sharply, or perhaps it was simply unfortunate enough to be directly over one of the larger stakes when the ebb reached its critical point. A 3 or 4 meter high stake, driven deep into the riverbed and angled at 45 degrees towards the river mouth, pierced the hull like a spear through paper. The wood splintered with a sound like a tree cracking in a storm, and water began gushing through the breach. The ship immediately pitched forward, its center of gravity shifting as the bilge filled with water. People scrambled frantically on the listing deck, screaming, trying to get overboard before the vessel completely capsized. Then another ship encountered the stakes, and then another. The heavier the ship, the more firmly it settled onto them as the water receded. The UN warships, designed for oceanic battles with deep keels and reinforced hulls, proved particularly vulnerable. They sat lower in the water than the lighter Vietnamese vessels, meaning they made contact with the stakes earlier and more forcefully as the water level dropped. Some stakes perforated the hull from below, others, angled, snagged ships attempting to deviate from the main stake field, tearing holes along their length. The zigzag pattern devised by Chan Hing Dao meant there was no safe direction. Turn left, you strike stakes. Turn right, you strike stakes. Attempt to retreat, you strike new stakes. The entire river channel had transformed into a deadly trap. Crews abandoned their ships, plunging into the water, believing they could swim to the banks. But there wasn't enough water for swimming. In places it was knee-deep, in others, thigh-deep, with treacherous currents and a silty riverbed that sucked at their feet with every step. Armored individuals became mired in the mud, unable to move forward or back, slowly sinking as they struggled. Mongol vessels began to collide with each other. Amidst the tumultuous attempts to reorient their paths, the captains lost formation. Ships that managed to evade the barrier crashed into those that could not. Oars shattered, and hulls splintered from the impacts. On some vessels, desperate crews tried to make for the riverbanks, believing that capture was preferable to drowning. Yet, the shores of the Bach Dang River were not inviting sandy beaches. Instead, they comprised muddy reed thickets and treacherous ground, offering no true refuge. As the tide receded further, an increasing number of stakes became visible. Ships that had merely been grounded suddenly found themselves impaled as the stakes, previously submerged directly beneath their keels, rose to meet them. The cacophony must have been terrifying. The rending of wood, the screams of men, and the shouted orders from officers that no one could obey. Beneath it all was the relentless, insistent sound of retreating water around the hulls, leaving the ships stranded on these wooden stakes like fish in a drained pond. At this juncture, the Vietnamese launched their assault from both banks of the river. From carefully prepared and preoccupied positions, Trun Hung Dao's ground forces unleashed a barrage. First came arrows, thousands raining down in successive waves upon the trapped ships. Mongol crews found themselves unable to retaliate effectively. They were on unstable decks, their vessels listing at impossible angles. Half their attention was consumed by trying to avoid falling into the water or being crushed between colliding ships. Incendiary arrows followed. These fiery projectiles, lodging themselves in the wooden decks and sails, sparked fires that spread rapidly in the dry spring air. Unimpaled vessels also caught fire. The crews faced an impossible predicament: remain on a burning ship or leap into the shallow, silt-laden waters where Vietnamese soldiers lay in wait. Stones and flammable materials rained down on the fleet. The Vietnamese had stockpiled these provisions along the banks in advance. Now, Every combustible item that could be hurled or shot at the captured ships was deployed. Isolated pockets of fire merged into massive conflagrations. The smoke intensified the chaos, reducing visibility and further hindering Mongol commanders from coordinating any organized defense. Vietnamese infantry advanced into the shallow waters, moving with the confidence of those fighting on familiar ground. They wielded weapons designed for close-quarters combat in water and mud. They understood how to navigate the marshland without getting stuck. They confronted an exhausted, demoralized, and literally immobilized adversary. This was not a battle, it was a massacre. The ebb tide reached its lowest point around midday. By this time, as the main channel of the Bach Dang resembled a shipyard after an earthquake, hundreds of wooden stakes, now fully exposed, protruded from the riverbed at various angles. Impaled on these stakes were UN warships in various states of disrepair. Some were perforated from below and slowly sinking. Others had capsized, their keels pointing skyward. Still others burned, sending columns of black smoke into the afternoon sky. Bodies floated in the remaining pools or lay spread out in the mud. Some Mongol soldiers attempted to surrender, dropping their weapons and begging for mercy. A few were taken prisoner, while others were cut down on the spot. In the heat and chaos of battle, restraint is not always possible, and the Vietnamese had ample reason to seek vengeance for months of invasion and devastation. Amur himself was captured somewhere during this catastrophe. Historical sources do not precisely detail when or how, only that he was taken alive, suggesting either extraordinary luck or perhaps a deliberate effort by Vietnamese forces to capture him rather than kill him. Prisoners held value. A captured admiral, especially one as distinguished as Amur, possessed considerable worth. By sunset, the Battle of Bach Dang was over. Casualty figures from various sources diverged significantly, as is typical for medieval battles. However, the most conservative estimates place the number of Mongols killed or captured in the tens of thousands. Some Vietnamese chronicles claim 300,000 dead or captured, which seems incredibly high. This figure likely encompasses not only sailors and marines, but also accompanying foot escorts and support personnel. The material losses were undeniable. 400 UN warships. Some were utterly destroyed, either impaled on stakes and submerged or burnt to the waterline. Others were captured intact, albeit damaged. 100 warships were destroyed. A total of 400 were incapacitated. The entire naval component of the Third Mongol invasion was annihilated in a single day. And a perfect coda to this disaster unfolded. Several days later, Zhang Wenhu, commander of the supply fleet meant to reinforce the invasion, finally approached Von Kiep. He was unaware of the Bach Dang battle. He did not know that Togan had already retreated to China. His supply vessels were directly steered into the same familiar system, now under the complete dominion of Vietnamese forces. They, too, obliterated his fleet. Zhang Hu himself managed to elude capture with just a handful of soldiers, fleeing all the way to Hainan. However, his provisions, food, and equipment, items that might have salvaged something from the incursion, either sank or fell into Vietnamese hands. Within a few months, Vietnam had dismantled 3 substantial Mongol forces: Tagan's ground troops, Amar's battle fleet, and Zhang Hu's supply convoy. The third invasion had concluded, ending in a catastrophe so profound it defied comprehension. All because of wooden stakes planted in the riverbed. When news reached Kublai Khan's court in China, the emperor's reaction was explosive. Consider Kublai's stature at this juncture of his life. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the individual who finalized the conquest of China and founded the Yuan Dynasty. He had vanquished the Southern Song, one of the most advanced states of the medieval era. He governed the largest contiguous empire in human history, spanning from Korea to Eastern Europe. By any measure, he was among the most triumphant rulers of his time. And now, for the third time, this small Southeast Asian kingdom had crushed his military. Yet, this was no mere defeat. It was a total annihilation. 400 warships vanished, along with tens of thousands of soldiers. His son, Tagan, who led the ground forces, was wounded by a poisoned arrow and forced to escape through the jungle like a common fugitive. Kublai's fury toward Tagan was immediate and all-encompassing. He exiled his son to Yanzhou for life, forbidding any future contact. This wasn't imprisonment, as Tagan remained a prince. Still, it marked a definitive banishment from court, stripping him of all military command or political influence. It was the harshest penalty Kublai could impose without resorting to execution, and he applied it without hesitation. The message was clear. A failure of this magnitude would not be forgiven, not even for a family member, and especially not for a family member. However, the person Kublai most wished to recover was Amar, not for punishment, but for restoration. Amar was an invaluable asset. He was the admiral who had helped conquer the Song dynasty. His experience and knowledge were irreplaceable. Yes, he had lost the fleet, but he had merely been following orders, implementing a strategy that Tagan had bungled on land. Moreover, he was alive, implying he could potentially lead another naval campaign. On their part, the Vietnamese initially seemed open to negotiation. King Tren Thien Tong proposed a settlement. Vietnam would formally accept vassalage to the Yuan Dynasty, regularly pay tribute, and acknowledge Yuan supremacy, provided Kublai Khan relinquished his conquest ambitions and released Vietnamese captives. This was a face-saving compromise. Vietnam retained internal autonomy, while China asserted nominal suzerainty. Part of these negotiations involved the return of captured Yuan officials and soldiers. In 1289, King Tren Thien Tong agreed to send Amar home. The admiral was placed on a ship bound for China. It appeared that a peaceful resolution was unfolding. Then, the ship sank. It simply sank. Somewhere between Vietnam and China, the vessel carrying Amar back to Kublai's court went down, and the admiral drowned. Of course, ships sink. This happens, particularly in the Middle Ages, when navigation was imprecise and shipbuilding inconsistent. But Vietnamese historical records quite clearly indicate what truly occurred. Prince Trun Hung Dao, who had initially opposed Amar's return, orchestrated the ship's sinking. He commanded the vessel to be deliberately scuttled, killing his captured adversary rather than allowing him to return to China, where he might lead another invasion fleet. Whether this was executed with King Tren Thien Tong's knowledge or against his wishes remains unclear. Sources suggest the king genuinely desired peace and was prepared to make concessions to achieve it. And while Tren Hung Dao remained convinced that the only good Mongol commander was a dead one, Amar anyway drowned. When Kublai received this news, he lost what little composure he had left. Historical chronicles describe him descending into a rage bordering on madness. He vowed to wipe Vietnam off the face of the earth. He immediately began planning a fourth invasion, one that would make the previous three appear as mere reconnaissance patrols. This was to be total war, complete eradication. He intended to depopulate the entire country if necessary. No more limited campaigns with specific objectives, only destruction. And frankly, I understand him. Put yourself in Kublai's position. You conquered China, Asia's most developed, populated, and wealthy state. You expanded Mongol power to its zenith. You govern an empire spanning continents. You had managed rebellions, succession disputes, and administrative challenges that would have crumbled lesser rulers. Yet, this one small kingdom in Southeast Asia consistently defied you, repeatedly shattered your armies, and continuously humiliated your generals. Now, they've not only annihilated your fleet, but also killed the admiral you most desired to recover, in what was clearly a premeditated political assassination. The sheer disrespect alone would justify another invasion in Kublai's mind. Add to this the strategic considerations: Vietnam's geographical position, controlling vital trade routes, and its potential as a base for further operations in Southeast Asia. This creates a situation where another campaign became inevitable. However, Kublai Khan never launched this fourth invasion. In 1294, 6 years after the battle on the Bach Dang River, Kublai Khan passed away. He was almost 80 years old, a very advanced age for that era. His death occurred before he could organize the large-scale punitive expedition he had planned, and with his demise, the entire political landscape shifted. Kublai's successor was Timur Khan, his grandson, who approached the Vietnamese problem in a fundamentally different way. Timur declared that the war with Dai Viet was over, completed. He sent a mission to the Vietnamese with the goal of restoring good neighborly relations. No more invasions or military campaigns, just formal relations where Vietnam acknowledged the suzerainty of the Yuan Dynasty in exchange for being left alone. Why did such a change occur? Partly because Khan Timur had his own political issues and could not afford to expend resources on what was clearly a losing endeavor. Partly because 3 failed attempts demonstrated that Vietnam could not be conquered with the forces the Yuan were willing to commit. And partly, one suspects, even the Mongols eventually realized that some objectives were not worth the costs involved in their acquisition. Vietnam never sent its king or a prince to the Yuan court. This had been one of the main sticking points in negotiations, something Kublai Khan had insisted upon as a sign of true submission. The Yuan dynasty maintained the appearance of vassalage while retaining complete internal independence. They paid tribute, sent diplomatic missions, but never truly submitted in any significant sense. And the Mongols never invaded Vietnam again, neither Timur nor his successors. The Yuan dynasty endured until 1368, for another 70 years or so, and throughout that entire period, they never once tried to subjugate the kingdom that had humiliated them 3 times. This irony is almost poetic. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered lands from Korea to Hungary, defeating every great military power in its path, was halted by wooden stakes in a river. The sophisticated military might of the Yuan, with its advanced technology and seasoned commanders, was defeated by tactics that were already 350 years old when applied. If you had told Kublai Khan at the zenith of his power that his invasion of Vietnam would be thwarted by wooden poles driven into a riverbed, he would have laughed in your face. If you had told Admiral Amar, as he entered the waters of Bach Dang that April morning in 1288, that he was about to be destroyed by a weapon his experience had taught him to despise, he would have considered you mad. But this is precisely what transpired. Sometimes experts are mistaken. Sometimes sophisticated technology loses to simple but flawlessly executed tactics. Sometimes old methods work precisely because they are old, because they have been tested, honed, and proven over centuries. And sometimes, just sometimes, the people you considered primitive and inferior turn out to be smarter than you thought. The Mongols learned their lesson at Bach Dang. They just paid a very high price for it. The Battle of Bach Dang was no accident. Tren Hung Dao was not lucky. Amar did not make a catastrophic error. This was a masterpiece of planning, preparation, and execution because Tren Hung Dao understood something fundamental about warfare that Amar had forgotten. Tren Hung Dao applied meticulous observation and measurement to create a weapon perfectly suited to specific conditions. Those weeks of studying the tides at Bach Dang constituted genuine hydrographic research. He measured depths hourly, calculated the ebb and flow, determined the rate of water level change, identified the strongest and weakest currents, and mapped the topography of the riverbed. He predicted that if the Mongol fleet could be lured into the river at high tide and held there until low tide, the ships would be trapped. Stakes, positioned at specific angles, would ensnare ships maneuvering in various directions. Vietnamese boats, being lighter and having shallow drafts, would pass over the stakes, while the heavier Mongol warships would become stuck. He was right in every detail. The predictions of failure, particularly those made by Admiral Amar, relied not only on his experience, but also on assumptions that hadn't been validated in this specific context. His naval expertise stemmed from the Chinese coast and different rivers under distinct conditions. His experience suggested that Vietnamese vessels were inferior to Yuan ships on the open sea, and retreating via river was a safer option than overland travel. Dismissing 350-year-old tactics, he believed there was no need to worry about them. All of these were logical, yet entirely flawed for conditions at Bach Dang. In April 1288, during torrential rains and low tide, Tren Hung Dao compelled his workers to secretly embed hundreds of stakes into the riverbed over several weeks. Each stake was positioned at precise angles and intervals, creating overlapping zones of entrapment. Fleet commanders were instructed to engage the numerically superior enemy, sustain casualties, and then skillfully retreat, luring the Mongols into the trap without succumbing to panic or breaking formation. a remarkably arduous task. Ground troops were to remain hidden for hours, observing the enemy ships, awaiting the attack signal, and refraining from revealing their positions prematurely. Every element had to converge perfectly: the tide at the correct level, the Mongol fleet in the precise location, and the troops ready. A single misstep would jeopardize the entire operation. However, nothing faltered. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Chen Hengdao recognized Amar's overconfidence and ruthlessly exploited it. Admiral Amar, who had bested the Song Dynasty fleet, pursued Vietnamese monarchs by sea, and commanded advanced 10th-century vessels, misinterpreted Vietnamese tactics as predictable. From his perspective, it was guerrilla warfare, sudden raids and attritional attacks. He concluded they avoided direct confrontation because they couldn't triumph in open battle. When Vietnamese boats appeared and immediately withdrew, Amar accepted it as normal. The power of confirmation bias is immense. We tend to perceive what we expect. Amar anticipated the Vietnamese would flee, so their retreat raised no questions for him. Chen Hengdao adeptly leveraged this self-assurance, providing Amar precisely what he expected until the tide receded, transforming those expectations into a deadly snare. The Bach Dang River wasn't merely a body of water. Its unique characteristics made it ideal for this strategy. Powerful tides caused significant fluctuations in water levels. Numerous tributaries and a complex terrain made navigation challenging, even without obstructions. The riverbed was firm enough to secure the stakes, but not so rocky as to prevent their implantation. Had Amar retreated via a different waterway with weak tides or deep channels navigable at low tide, this tactic wouldn't have worked. But it was the environment itself that rendered the weapon effective. Chen Hengdao simply recognized this potential and devised a strategy grounded in this reality. Despite their military genius, the Mongols at times underestimated such factors. They conquered steppes using mobility and cavalry and adapted to siege warfare by adopting Chinese methods. Yet, they struggled in conditions that nullified their advantages. The Vietnamese jungles, where cavalry was useless and heat exposure debilitating, and the Japanese typhoons, which twice annihilated their invasion fleets. Terrain can often outweigh technology or training. The stakes alone didn't destroy the Mongol fleet. They immobilized it. The fleet was obliterated by fire arrows, and ground forces eliminated the crews. The shallow waters offered no escape, and the psychological shock completely shattered the Mongols' morale. Each element amplified the others. Ships impaled on stakes couldn't maneuver to evade fire arrows, and the flames forced crews to leap into the water, where ground troops awaited them. The impossibility of rescue and the horrifying spectacle of fleets trapped on wooden spikes triggered a panic that made organized resistance impossible. This sophisticated interplay was precisely what Amar failed to grasp. He perceived wooden stakes as primitive weapons, yet he should have seen a complex system of interconnected tactical elements, each meticulously designed to offset Vietnamese weaknesses and exploit Mongol vulnerabilities. Technology doesn't win wars, strategy does. Possessing superior weaponry is advantageous, but it's not the decisive factor. The key is aligning your capabilities with the actual situation. Amar brought advanced warships to a battle that demanded an understanding of tidal rivers. He applied naval experience honed fighting Chinese admirals against Vietnamese guerrilla tacticians. He brought a conception of warfare to an environment where those very notions proved perilous. Chen Hengdao brought wooden stakes to a tidal river and emerged victorious. The experts were wrong. The ancient tactic proved triumphant. For this specific battle, in this singular location, against this particular foe, rudimentary weaponry proved to be remarkably effective. The 400 Mongol ships paid dearly for this lesson. In 1953, while constructing a dam in the Kamunsiang region of Quang Ninh province, Vietnamese laborers dredging the riverbed encountered something solid, ancient, dark, and weathered, yet still sturdy timber. After centuries submerged in salt water and mud, they unearthed stakes. Hundreds of them were driven deep into the river bottom, precisely where Chen Hengdao's forces had placed them 665 years prior. Some stood upright, others angled at 15 to 45 degrees. They were still positioned to inflict damage on ships from multiple directions. Their lengths varied from 2 to 5 meters, and their sharpened tips remained intact. This discovery caused a sensation throughout Vietnam, prompting immediate deployment of archaeological teams. Meticulous excavations revealed the stakes arranged in a zigzag pattern, spaced 0.9 to 1.5 meters apart, exactly as described in historical chronicles. Some had broken tops, while others showed traces of iron cladding, albeit corroded. The wood itself was ironwood, an incredibly dense material renowned for its exceptional resistance to decay, surpassing almost all other timbers in Southeast Asia. Official excavations commenced in 1959, uncovering more stakes, pottery fragments, bricks, and 10th century artifacts. In 1988, on the battle's 700th anniversary, the Vietnamese government formally recognized the Bach Dang stake field as a national historical monument. In 2012, Bach Dang Giang was elevated to a special national historical relic. Then, from 2019 to 2020, archaeological surveys near Huang revealed additional, larger stake fields than previously known, indicating that the defensive preparations were even more extensive than historians had assumed. Today, some of these stakes are displayed at the National Museum of Vietnamese History in Hanoi. They appear surprisingly mundane, simply old wooden stakes, darkened by time, smoothed by water, and worn by years of use. Nothing remarkable, if not for the knowledge of their history. Yet, it is precisely in this ordinariness that their significance lies. These were not mystical artifacts or lost technologies. They were common wooden stakes, a simple tool humankind had utilized for millennia. And they proved incredibly effective because they were flawlessly deployed at the right place, at the opportune moment, against the appropriate adversary. The Battle of Bach Dang became foundational to Vietnamese national identity. It is not merely a military victory studied in schools and commemorated with monuments. It is a national emblem of Vietnam's resistance to foreign invaders, a demonstration of Vietnamese ingenuity against overwhelming force, and the Vietnamese people's resolve to employ any available means to defend their autonomy. During French colonial rule, Vietnamese patriots drew inspiration from the history of Bach Dang. It offered proof that Vietnam could overcome a vastly superior foreign power through intellect, determination, and intelligent use of terrain. During the war against the Americans, North Vietnamese strategies directly referenced Bach Dang as a model. General Vo Nguyen Giap, who masterminded the Tet Offensive and many major campaigns, meticulously studied Chang Hang Dao's tactics. The core lesson consistently remained: technologically superior invaders can be defeated by defenders who better understand the terrain, are willing to employ unconventional methods, and possess the patience to execute complex plans over prolonged periods. To grasp the full magnitude of this accomplishment, one must recall that the Mongol Empire in 1288 stretched from Korea to Hungary. They had conquered Khwarezm, crushed the Islamic Caliphate, devastated Eastern Europe, subjugated Rus, and, after decades of warfare, overthrown the Yuan Dynasty. It was the most expansive contiguous empire in human history, governing over 100 million people. Every formidable adversary they encountered had been vanquished: the Jin state, Khwarezm, Kiev, and Rus, the Eastern European kingdoms, and the Song. Some of these were among the most advanced states of the medieval world, possessing centuries-old military traditions and cutting-edge technologies. The Mongols defeated them all, yet they could not subdue Vietnam. 3 attempts, 3 defeats. The third defeat at Bach Dang was so comprehensive and crushing that they never tried again. Kublai Khan died still planning a 4th invasion, but his successors abandoned the idea. Vietnam is on the remarkably short list of powers that successfully resisted Mongol conquest. Japan managed it twice, thanks to typhoons destroying the invasion fleets. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt halted the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, preventing their expansion into Africa. And Vietnam accomplished it thrice. This was achieved by strategically deploying wooden stakes within the tidal rivers during their final victory. This particular conflict serves as a potent illustration of the inherent limits of sophisticated military equipment when it is misused without adequately comprehending local conditions. The Yuan Dynasty commanded some of the most advanced military technology of the 10th century. This included formidable composite bows, offering exceptional range and penetrating power, siege engines capable of demolishing fortified cities, early forms of gunpowder weaponry, and vessels meticulously constructed by Chinese artisans who had refined naval architecture over centuries. Yet, none of this advanced arsenal proved effective at Bach Dang. All these technological innovations, expertise, and skilled personnel were rendered useless when applied in an environment that nullified their inherent advantages. Contemporary armies continue to grapple with this very challenge. American forces in Vietnam between 1960 and 1970 possessed an overwhelming technological superiority, boasting helicopters, airplanes, artillery, and the most cutting-edge communication equipment globally. Nevertheless, they were defeated by an adversary employing tactics that had fundamentally remained unchanged since the era of Chan Hung Dao. Soviet troops in Afghanistan during the 1980s were equipped with tanks, attack helicopters, and modern weapon systems. They were overcome by Mujahideen fighters who utilized decades-old weaponry and, at times, centuries-old tactical approaches. Technology alone does not guarantee victory in warfare. It must be applied judiciously within contexts where it genuinely provides a strategic edge. When engaged in battles under conditions that negate these advantages, no amount of technology can ensure success. Admiral Amar grasped this profound lesson. The Yuan Dynasty learned it as well. Many military forces since then have encountered the same harsh reality, typically discovering it through great difficulty. Wooden stakes remain effective if employed correctly. Ancient methods still yield results when there's an understanding of their original design principles. And occasionally, individuals once perceived as primitive or inferior can impart an unforgettable lesson in warfare. Vietnam unequivocally delivered such a lesson to the Mongols at Bach Dang, with wooden stakes in the spring of 1288. We know that the Mongol Empire, which subjugated territories from Korea to Hungary and vanquished every major power in its path, was decisively halted by a kingdom it had expected to conquer easily. Sometimes, experts are mistaken, and sometimes, intricate technologies are defeated by straightforward, flawlessly executed tactics. Sometimes, archaic methods succeed precisely because they are old, because they have been tested, refined, and validated over centuries. The Mongol fleet possessed superior armaments, but Vietnam excelled in strategic foresight. The Mongols had advanced technology, whereas Vietnam deeply understood its indigenous environment. The Mongols harbored overconfidence born from an uninterrupted string of victories, while Vietnam was driven by desperation to resist 3 invasions, resolutely refusing to surrender. Ultimately, intellect triumphed over technology, understanding surpassed experience, desperation overcame confidence, and wooden stakes proved more formidable than warships. This encapsulates the narrative of the Battle of Bach Dang, and this is the central takeaway from April 9, 1288. Therefore, even 737 years later, we still recall the day when the mighty Mongol Empire entered the river and was never able to leave. If this story has captured your imagination, if you found yourself rooting for those wooden stakes as they emerged from the water, and if you now view simple technologies in a new light, then please help me propagate this narrative further. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts on other historical instances where underdogs triumphed not through brute force, but through ingenuity. History is replete with such examples of battles where conventional wisdom was overturned, where experts were proven wrong, and where those considered primitive or inferior imparted an indelible lesson to so-called advanced civilizations. These stories deserve to be told, and I am only just beginning to share them. Thank you for your attention.